ask here is, why does this eternal universe exist? Is it necessary? Does it exist by a necessity of its own nature? Or does it have an external cause?
Dr. Craig, let me go ahead and give you the other objection that would be raised here. Namely, if you're going to say that God explains himself, God is the explanation for his own existence, why couldn't you just say that about the universe? Instead of taking that extra step back to God, why not just say the universe explains its own existence?
Now, it's important to understand that that would involve a radical retrenchment on the atheist's part. As I said, the overwhelming majority of atheists believe that if atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence, which means that if the universe does have an explanation of its existence, then God exists, that atheism is not true. So I really can't think of any contemporary atheist who thinks that the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. Rather, they believe to a man that the universe is just a brute, unexplained, inexplicable contingent. But for the sake of argument, let's consider an atheist who says, well, the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. I think there's some good reasons to think that the universe does not exist by a necessity of its own nature. As we look out at the universe, it doesn't seem like any of the things that exist in the universe exist necessarily. If matter and energy had been differently configured, none of those things would have existed. In fact, at some point in the past, none of those things did exist. So it doesn't appear that the things in the universe exist necessarily. Now, someone might say, well, all right, but what about the matter and energy themselves? The matter and energy can be in different shapes and forms, but the matter and energy exist necessarily. Well, the problem with that, I think, is that according to contemporary physics, the basic building blocks of the matter and energy in the universe are these tiny fundamental particles like quarks or electrons, or they're little tiny strings of energy. And what the atheist would have to say is that every single one of these quarks exists by a necessity of its own nature, which is just fantastic. Surely a different collection of quarks could have existed than the collection of quarks that actually exist. And if that's true, then you would have a different universe. It would show that this is not a universe that exists by a necessity of its own nature. I don't know anybody who thinks that every quark in the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature. That just seems to be outlandish. So I think that we have very good reason to think the universe doesn't exist necessarily. I would also add that we do have very good grounds for thinking that the universe is not eternal in the past, but did have a beginning. And if the universe came into being, then that proves that it's not necessary, because anything that exists necessarily has to exist eternally. It can't come into being. So if the universe did come into being, that would show that it exists contingently and not necessarily.
Now,
Kalam's cosmological
right?
argument can supplement the argument from contingency by showing that the universe doesn't exist by a necessity of its own nature.
Well, why don't you go through the Kalam argument with us?
Okay, that's the next argument that I share, and it is very simple. It basically goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Things don't just come into being without a cause. Things that begin to exist have a cause that brings them into being. But the universe began to exist. We have good philosophical reasons as well as good scientific evidence that the universe began to exist. And from that, it follows, therefore, the universe has a cause. And what you then do is analyze what it means to be a cause of the universe, a cause of space and time, matter and energy. And many of the traditional attributes of God can be recovered from this sort of philosophical analysis, so that ultimately you conclude that there exists an uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, personal creator of the universe of unfathomable power, which is a core conception of what theists mean by God.
Now, this the first premise there, I think, is extremely important, because when you hear sort of street apologetics, and I've even seen sort of lay-level Christian apologetics works that will start off by saying everything has a cause of its existence, and then they'll go forward to give some version of the cosmological argument for God's existence. But that's not what you're arguing here. You're not saying everything has a cause of its existence, because the obvious objection
say,
there.
in all honesty, I don't hear Christians making this mistake. What I hear is atheists setting up this straw man argument in the mouths of Christians and then saying, aha, then what's God's cause? But I think this is just a caricature that atheists have propounded of the cosmological argument. But I don't hear intelligent Christian apologists saying everything has a cause. I don't know of any theist in the history of thought that has said that everything has a cause.
Oh, I agree, but I have seen it at kind of a lay level.
Exist has a cause.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so you would take that first premise as self-evident?
Well, I think it's self-evident, yes. I think that when you contemplate the idea of coming into being, that the idea that being could come from non-being is just metaphysically absurd. And this idea that being only comes from being is as old as Plato and the early Greek philosophers. This is a fundamental principle of classical metaphysics, that out of nothing, nothing comes. And that therefore, if something comes into being, there must be another being of some sort that has caused it and brought it into existence. But I think you could also give arguments for this. For example, anything that comes into being is the actualization of its potentiality to be. Things have the potentiality of existing, but in order for them to come into being, that potential has to be actualized. But no potentiality can actualize itself. Only an actuality can actualize the potentiality of something else to be. And therefore, again, it would follow that anything that comes to be must have a cause, because you need an actual being in order to actualize its potentiality for existence. And what's interesting in the case of the universe is that prior to the existence of the universe, there wasn't even the potentiality of its existence. There was just nothing on atheism. So it seems utterly impossible on atheism that the universe could come into being. It seems to me you have to have an actual being with the potential to create the universe, which would be theism. And finally, I do think we have the best of empirical evidence for the truth of that first premise. It's universally confirmed in our experience. It's never falsified. So purely on a scientific basis, we have the best of evidence for thinking that everything that begins to exist has a cause.
So if we take one as true for various reasons, how would you say we can prove two, that the universe began to exist?
Well, there's a long tradition in Judeo-Christian Islamic thought of arguing on philosophical grounds for the beginning of the universe. And I'm persuaded that these are good arguments. One of these arguments would be based on the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things. You can show that if an actually infinite number of things could really exist, it leads to all sorts of counterintuitive absurdities. And therefore, I think it makes it very plausible that you cannot have an actually infinite number of things actually exist. But that means that the series of past events must be finite, because otherwise you would have an actually infinite number of past events. So that would be one argument for the finitude of the past. Another argument that would be quite independent would be that you cannot form a collection that is actually infinite by adding one member after another. The only way that an actually infinite number of things could exist would be if they all came into existence simultaneously. But the series of past events has come into being by one event being added after another. The events of the past have come into being sequentially. The series of past events has occurred one event after another until you get to today. But if you cannot form an actually infinite number of things by adding one member after another, it follows that the series of past events cannot be infinite. There must have been a beginning to the series of past events, and therefore a beginning to the universe itself. So those would be two arguments that I think are good arguments for the finitude of the past and the beginning of the universe.
So let me. When you were defending your first premise, let me raise an objection here. You said prior to the existence of the universe. If we're talking about prior to the existence of the universe, I'm assuming you would agree that time is a property of our universe. Therefore, what sense could we make of saying before the universe existed? Because this is time language. This is temporal language. So how can we talk about before there was any time?
You have to quote my entire sentence. I said, prior to the existence of the universe, there was no potentiality for its existence. And that's a coherent statement. That is to say, there is no potentiality for the existence of the universe prior to the existence of the universe, because there is no prior to the existence of the universe. It's to say that there wasn't anything prior to the existence of the universe. That time begins at the Big Bang, or begins at the moment of creation, and therefore there just is nothing prior to the existence of the universe. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, of course I do. I'm trying to clarify stuff.
Well, then I'm going to ask it, maybe a dumb question, but so before the universe, now that we're on that topic, so, and I'm thinking like a man, I think, how long was it, how much time took place, since God always, well, that doesn't make sense either. God always existed, so how can I even ask this question? How long was God around before he created the universe? Makes no sense.
If time began at the beginning of the universe, that's a meaningless question.
Right.
There was no time prior to the beginning of the universe, because there is no prior to the beginning of the universe. Time begins at the moment of creation. So what we would want to say is that God existing alone without the universe is timeless.
Right. Very good.
He always exists, not in the temporal sense, but in the sense that he never began to exist. He simply transcends time.
Well, speaking of time, we have some time. We have no callers at this point, so if anyone would like to, this is a golden opportunity to speak with a leading, if not the leading authority on exposing atheism. He's here tonight, ready to handle your calls. Some of you may be out there like me, maybe slightly overwhelmed by the information, but it's certainly a great opportunity to come in, to call in, and ask a question of the expert here, and of course with David Wood as well, a former atheist. I'm surrounded by two theists, and I myself am a theist, not an atheist. And so if any other theist out there, or any atheist out there, would like to call, please do. Take the opportunity at 248-416-1300. We'll be going to a break in a few minutes or so. One of the oppositions I hear, frankly, when it comes down to it, wouldn't you say, Doctor, that somebody who doesn't accept or doesn't admit anyway that there's a God, that there's a God that created the universe, I've always felt that as soon as you do that, you automatically say, well, then if I don't accept him, kind of pretend he's not there, or say that I don't believe he's there, well, then I'm safe. But when I start to say, okay, there's a God who created me, then at that point I immediately have to say, well, then I must probably, since he created me, have to obey him, have to submit to him. Would you say submission to God is, or not wanting to submit to God, is perhaps another reason why people don't admit there is a God?
Well, you're asking me here about the psychological motives behind atheism. And as a philosopher, I simply will not address that sort of question. I am interested in assessing the soundness of arguments for or against the existence of God.